Welcome back to our second of two videos about utilitarianism. In our last video, we got an introduction to classical utilitarianism and some of the common objections to it. In this video, I want to consider how contemporary utilitarianism has tried to address some of those objections, and I want to share with you some considerations you might want to have in your mind about whether you think the contemporary utilitarians have adequately addressed those objections. To do that, we're going to start by considering a famous example used by Peter Singer to illustrate what utilitarianism would demand of us. As Singer says in the preface to the assigned book, The Life You Can Save, the demands that he's going to talk about are stringent. Some would say impossible, he even admits. Yet, contemporary utilitarianism has other ways of talking about the demandingness objection that we learned about last time. Singer says basically this: look, behaviorally, people just may not be accustomed to or capable of the extent of self-sacrificial acts required of them by utilitarianism. But while Singer says that utilitarianism still might be the right way of determining the rightness of acts, there are reasons, which we'll see near the end of this video, that utilitarianism should be based instead on judging the rightness of the rules that we follow. It might not be too demanding to say, follow a rule that says you should be as self-sacrificial as is reasonable in your circumstances. You could do better than that rule, but the rule would be good. Stating this in a more abstract way, it's common to recognize that contemporary utilitarians make sort of two transitions in utilitarianism. I'm not going to call them full changes, just transitions, something like a shift in emphasis. First, for them, utilitarianism is less about acts than it is about rules. Thus, the key advice sort of changes from do those acts, which bring about the most predicted utility of the acts available to you, to this instead: follow those rules which bring about the most predicted utility. But the advice only sort of changes, because ultimately a utilitarian is still going to say to break the rules, even generally useful or happiness-producing rules, when you're certain that there's a rule-breaking act available to you which will better serve the very purpose of happiness, better than following the rule, that would be. How often will you be certain? That's hard to say, but they will always say that. Second thing, when we push this point even further, we see that for contemporary utilitarians, the theory is no longer best thought of even as a decision-making procedure at all, for either rules or acts. It's best thought of instead as a justification of the right-making features of a rule or an act. Or you might sometimes hear someone say something even a bit milder than that the theory only provides an account of the right-making features of a rule or an act, as if perhaps only explanatory in nature. What's meant by either of these ways of talking about the right-making features is this: whatever it is that makes primarily rules right, or secondarily acts right, must be their tendency to maximize the good. And we'll see that this could mean that a rule that came about for entirely different reasons than its tendency to maximize utility is nevertheless acceptable to a utilitarian if it has the correct right-making features. How do we come by these rules? Well, again, to sort of hit on this distinction, there could be other decision-making modes than utilitarian logic. We might simply follow democratic or other procedures for making the rules, and then only assess, justify, or account for them using utilitarianism. It could be that custom or habit gave us some rules, but if you can account for their right-making features with reference to the good that they do, increasing or even maximizing that good, then they're good. Yes, utilitarians would argue to change rules that do not increase happiness, but not necessarily to use utility-maximizing reasoning as our decision-making procedure. And that should give us some context for what I believe Lazari, Radek, and Singer are in fact arguing in their book, an argument that's going to unfold over the course of this entire video. Since most of today's utilitarians do not think that it provides us with a decision-making procedure for acts, Lazari, Radek, and Singer are saying instead that it provides us with a justification for the common sense rules we ordinarily live our lives by. We'll see that to them, Sidgwick's justification of the principle of utility and Sidgwick's emphasis on what he first called common sense morality, those things provide a lot of the basis for their utilitarianism. Not all of it, but quite a bit. At the very end of this video, we're going to see that they do add some things. One of these is a definition of rational justice that they adopt from J.C. Harsanyi, but that all comes later. Now, I'll admit, a lot of this gets somewhat confusing and doesn't seem to actually fit utilitarian authors because they seem to be using example after example after example of acts that they want you to judge wrong. They seem to be saying, think about this example using utility as your guide. But most often, the examples are just trying to point to the right-making features of the intuitions that you have. And then they're kind of trying to bootstrap those intuitions into an account of right-making features more generally. So the examples serve as what philosophers sometimes call an intuition pump. But it's the philosophical principles that result from thinking through our intuitions, thinking through then the reasons that we give for our intuitions, indeed even thinking through the reasons we give for our reasons, that are the point of these examples. This, I think, is also true of Singer's famous drowning child example. The point isn't to draw a conclusion about whether you'd save this drowning child. You would be roundly condemned by everyone if you didn't. Literally, every moral theory would give reasons why saving this child is the right thing to do. But the point is to consider why you should do it, and then to expand that into a full principle. Here's the example. This again is from Singer, The Life You Can Save. It's on page 3. He says exactly this. On your way to work, you pass a small pond. On hot days, children sometimes play in the pond, which is only about knee-deep. The weather is cool today, though, and the hour is early, so you're surprised to see a child splashing about in the pond. As you get closer, you see that it is a very young child, just a toddler who's flailing about, unable to stay upright or walk out of the pond. You look for the parents or the babysitter, but there's no one else around. The child is unable to keep her head above the water for more than a few seconds at a time. If you don't wade in and pull her out, she seems likely to drown. Wading in is easy and safe, but you'll ruin the new shoes that you bought only a few days ago and get your suit wet and muddy. By the time you hand the child over to someone responsible for her and change your clothes, you'll be late for work. What should you do? Now, I think it's fair to say that the question that Singer asks here shouldn't be, what should you do? It should be, why should you do it? That, ultimately, is the question that he wants us to answer, as I'm about to show you. And here's what he says are the premises of his answer. There are 3 of them, and you'll find them on The Life You Can Save, page 19. He says exactly this. First premise, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Second premise, if it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it is wrong not to do so. Third premise, by donating to effective charities, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. And so he says it's at least possible that utilitarianism requires this much of you. It's on page 22. You must keep cutting back on unnecessary spending and donating what you save until you have reduced yourself to the point where if you give any more, you'll be sacrificing something nearly as important as preventing malaria, like giving so much that you can no longer afford an adequate education for your own children. So, notice what Singer's utilitarianism requires of you here. It requires a computation that we called in the last video an interpersonal comparison of utility. He wants you to compare what, say, $500 shoes are worth to you against what a life is worth to the person who lives it. That may seem easy to you, but what if it were $5,000? $500,000? $5 million? Are we always so certain that a dollar value can be put on life to make a life comparable to a wad of bills? There's a problem here. If you accept that why you should save the child is because the utility of life for her is greater than the utility of shoes to you, if that's why saving her is right, then at some point you may have to accept that some dollar value for you or for all of us is not worth it anymore. Ultimately, whether we can make that judgment boils down to whether we can justify the famous principle of utility. In our last video, we saw that Bentham defines that as the greatest good for the greatest number. And some of the basic questions you'll want to start asking in order to do this process of justifying the principle of utility would be this: why should we care about utility? And especially, why care about it for others? You need to answer both of those things in order to accept Singer's answer to why we save the drowning child. And that's why, in the chapter you have on Canvas, Lazari, Radic, and Singer review a number of the classic and contemporary theories of utilitarianism in order to sort of suss out the best answer to these questions. As they discuss in Chapter 2, Jeremy Bentham, the founder of utilitarianism, thought that no direct proof could actually be offered of this principle. It just is right. Yet that doesn't seem satisfying. Without this principle, utilitarianism fails. Now you first, practically, have to be able to compare your happiness to those of others, and then morally have a reason to be concerned about the happiness of others in order to be moved to sacrifice some of your own happiness for theirs when the situation calls for it. So later utilitarians had to try again to give a better, rational proof of the principle of utility. As I said in the last video, John Stuart Mill said it is simply true that the happiness of others moves or motivates us in a way similar to our own happiness. Lazari, Radic, and Singer criticized Mill's argument for this on 21 to 22. Mill had said exactly this: no reason can be given why the general happiness is desirable, except that each person, so far as he believes it to be attainable, desires his own happiness. Each person's happiness is a good to that person, and the general happiness, therefore, a good to the aggregate of persons. So, because of that, Mill seemed to be saying, there's some debate about his ideas on this point, but he seemed to be saying not only that you should, but that you already do desire the good of the aggregate of persons. But as Lazari, Radic, and Singer imply, that's somewhat foolish. It relies on a computational fallacy of sorts. Just because A's happiness is good to A, and B's happiness is a good to B, doesn't mean that the aggregate happiness is a good to them both. What if A prefers their own happiness to that of B? B prefers their own happiness to that of A? Or in a common objection that James Rachels raises, what if a given person's desire is to be happy themselves at the expense of others? Should we throw that into the aggregate calculation and make B less happy so that A can get their jollies from this? Mill just simply asserts that this is ruled out by the principle of equality. Remember, one of the propositions we started the last video with was that everybody is to count for one and no one for more than one. So Mill said we have to view the good of all as an impartial spectator would. We have to show no partiality towards ourselves. We have to be concerned about the good of all equally. But that would make equality, rather than or along with utility, a core principle of his system. That's not bad. The idea of the impartial spectator was endorsed by many utilitarians after Mill, in fact, but it simply pushes the question of justification back a step. Now, how can we justify equality? For help with this, Lazari, Radic, and Singer turn to Sidgwick, about whom they co-wrote another book. They discuss him on page 25 of what you read. Sidgwick had argued that a few principles were self-evident, he said. He said these were the principles of justice, treat similar cases alike; prudence, give equal concern to all of the moments of your own conscious life, valuing your future as much as you do this present; and benevolence, value the good of any other as much as your own. So, great. If you can argue that utility is backed up by justice, prudence, and benevolence, you'd see why we should care for our own utility and that of others. But this, as well, simply pushes the problem of justification back a step. How do we know justice, prudence, and benevolence are self-evident? Here again, Lazari, Radek, and Singer turn to someone else for an assist. They talk about J.C. Harsanyi on page 26. Harsanyi argued that it might simply be a definition of rationality, game-theoretic rationality even. If we factor in something like our prudent concern for ourselves over the long, unforeseeable years of our lives, it might simply be rational that we be just. His is sort of a rational choice argument for justice, rational justice, as I called it earlier. Harsanyi argued that if we made our decisions only thinking about our own happiness, but imagining that we had an equal chance in this world of being someone else as we do of being ourselves, then we would arrange things in such a way as to ensure that each relevant position that we could end up in the future would experience some good. Who knows, in the future, you might be in an advantaged or a disadvantaged social position. Harsanyi wouldn't ask us to neglect ourselves in any sacrificial sense. He simply argues that we would rationally decide to pursue our own long-term good, given some uncertainty about our future life, by creating justice between all of the relevant positions that we could be in. Yet, a closing point. Utilitarianism is still computationally demanding. I'm going to leave you with this suggestion about Lazari, Radek, and Singer. In order to make utilitarianism less computationally demanding, they lean on Sidgwick again, and they get back to the argument that we opened this video with, that utilitarianism is not best seen as a philosophy guiding action choice, nor even as a decision-making process for rules per se. It's really better seen as a philosophy for finding what's right in the rules that we follow and should follow. They discuss this argument in Sidgwick on pages 24 to 25 of their book. Sidgwick had said that utility may not actually contradict our common sense morality, things like do not tell a lie, but it gives us reasons for these common sense rules, and of course, reasons to reform or alter them when they do not lead to the greater happiness. On this account, then, the rules we follow are the means we have of guiding our actions towards the greater good. They're not perfect guides, of course, but rule following would make decisions much less computationally demanding. So, in a sense, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. Sidgwick had to posit certain self-evident principles to back up the principle of utility, but if, in so doing, he could better explain what's good about the rules that we follow, and if he could critique them when they're bad, he could make utilitarianism not impossible, as Singer had worried in the quote that we considered earlier, but very possible indeed.